So I've been using this lens here, the Sony 70-200 f4 macro G OSS version 2 lens, basically ever since it came out last summer in 2023. I purchased it, I think it was August, September of 2023, so just after it came out. And when I first bought it, I made an initial impressions video just sharing some of the things I liked about this lens. But now that I've been using this lens for about a year, I've had some comments from people saying, hey, do you still like this lens? How has it performed across the different projects that you've used it on? And so what I want to do today is kind of make a follow-up video to my initial video and just share my thoughts on using this lens over the past year. I've used this lens on weddings, on commercial and brand projects, on travel projects, personal projects. It's really been an integral part of my kit for the last year or so. And so today I just kind of want to share my long-term thoughts on this lens after using it for a year, some of the pros, some of the cons, things I've liked, things I haven't, and honestly just hopefully help you answer the question, is this lens a right purchase for you today, or should you look at a different lens? So the first thing I want to touch on is why I initially bought this lens to begin with. And honestly, the simple reason is because I needed more lenses. Back in August of 2023, I had recently switched over my video kit from a Canon kit to a Sony kit, and at the time I only owned one Sony E-mount lens, which was the lens I'm filming this video on, the Sigma 24-70 f2.8. And the Sigma 24-70 is a phenomenal lens. I really love it. I still use it to this day, but I didn't have any lenses that would go beyond 70 millimeters. And so there were a few things I wanted in my lens kit. Number one, I wanted a telephoto lens. I wanted to be able to get a little bit more reach than the 70 millimeters on my Sigma lens. I also really wanted a macro lens, specifically because I shoot weddings and I wanted to be able to shoot some close-up detail shots and all that. But the caveat was I really didn't want to spend a lot of money on lenses. I had just recently invested in the Sony FX3 and the Sigma 24-70, and I just didn't have a lot of extra money to spend on lenses. And right around that time is when Sony announced this lens, and honestly, this lens kind of checked all the boxes for me. It's a 70-200 lens, so it covered that nice telephoto range that I needed. It had built-in stabilization, which was perfect for the video work that I was doing. It also offered some great macro capabilities, so I would kind of have a telephoto lens and a macro lens all in one, and it came in at a pretty reasonable price point for a lens of this caliber. As a reference, the Sony 70-200 f2.8 lens cost like $2,800, and this lens was $1,000 cheaper than that lens, and really the only trade-off was that this lens is an f4 lens versus the other lens being an f2.8 lens. So I made the decision to purchase this lens knowing that I was shooting on the Sony FX3 and I had the dual base ISO where I could increase my ISO up to 12,800 and still have a relatively clean image. I figured that high extra base ISO would really kind of compensate for the loss in light from an f4 lens versus having an f2.8 lens. And this lens has been an integral part of my kit ever since. So let's talk about my experience with this lens and just kind of my overall thoughts on the lens. And honestly, my experience with this lens has been really, really great. It's been a fantastic lens across the board, especially on the FX3, where that higher dual base ISO kind of negates the loss in light of only being able to open up to f4. The focus is extremely accurate and quick. The image is crisp and clear. I've been really, really impressed with the images that have come out of this lens. And honestly, the overall size and weight make this lens kind of perfect for like my run and gun travel filmmaking, just to kind of throw in a bag. As a reference, with my Sony a7 IV, this lens is really not that much bigger than the a7 IV is in general, and so this lens is pretty compact, especially for the telephoto range that it offers and the macro capabilities, and so it's honestly just been a really all-around versatile performer for me. So let's talk about a few concerns I've had with this lens and how this lens has kind of addressed those concerns and performed around those concerns. And the first concern I have is pretty obvious. It's going to be low light performance because this lens only opens up to f4. Now, conveniently, this lens opens up to a static f4 all the way through the zoom range. And so whether you're at 70 millimeters or zooming all the way through 200 millimeters, the f4 is a constant aperture all the way through. So that's really nice, but f4 versus f2.8 is definitely a noticeable change in light lost. And so I was a little bit concerned about how this lens would perform in low light situations. But honestly, on the FX3, which is the camera I primarily purchased this lens to use on, I really haven't had any issues with it. And that's because that high base ISO on the FX3 of 12,800 has kind of compensated for the loss in light with the aperture only opening up to f4. Now that being said, on cameras that aren't the FX3, that just don't have the ISO performance of the FX3, for instance my a7 IV, when I've been shooting video on the a7 IV, I've definitely wished that my aperture would open wider than f4. Even though you can definitely do a lot of noise reduction in post, there's definitely been times where I just kind of wished I had more low light performance from the lens. Now that being said, as I've kind of thought about the future of my lens kit and the lenses that I want to invest in down the road, I really don't think a 70-200 millimeter lens is going to be my low light telephoto lens of choice. I recently shot a job out in Wyoming and I rented the Sony 135mm f1.4, and that lens was phenomenal, especially in low light. And so I honestly think down the road I'll probably invest in either the 135 or even the 85mm lens, and I'll use one of those lenses as my low light telephoto option, especially for the photography side of things. And so I really don't think you can fault this lens for being an f4, and honestly on the FX3 with that high dual base ISO, it's been fantastic. The other question that I had about this lens is, with the aperture only opening to f4, how was it going to feel depth of field wise? Was I going to really miss the creamy bokeh background, or was it still going to feel like there was a lot of good separation? And honestly, I haven't noticed it once. And maybe that's just me and my shooting style, but I tend to not shoot completely wide open anyway, even on my lenses that open all the way up to like 1.2 or something. I usually stop down just a little bit, especially when I'm filming video, just so I have a little bit of a grace period on the focal plane. That's just a personal style for me. And so I really haven't noticed it. And especially at like 200mm and f4, there's so much separation between the foreground and the background anyway. I really haven't noticed it at all. Obviously, if I were to do a head-to-head comparison between the 7200 f4 and the 7200 f2.8, obviously the 2.8 is going to have more bokeh, more of a separation between foreground and background. But honestly, in my experience with it, I really haven't noticed it. And I've never been in a situation where I found myself wishing I could open the aperture up more specifically for depth of field purposes. And again, thinking for myself personally, long-term, my goal is to purchase the 135, and that would kind of become my depth of field telephoto lens. And so obviously that would kind of cover that specific scenario if I needed the extra depth of field at a telephoto range. So now I want to talk about who I think this lens is for. After using it for a year, I kind of have a really good idea of what this lens is really good at, what this lens isn't good at, and I think the target audience of this lens, of which honestly I am the target audience. I really genuinely love this lens. It's been fantastic in my kit. But let's go ahead and answer the question, who is this lens actually for? So I would say this lens is perfect for anybody who wants a quality general purpose telephoto that also has some macro capabilities. So if you're shooting travel or landscape, wildlife, weddings, events, documentary work, anything like that, I think this lens would really be perfect for you. This has been exactly the use case that I've used this lens in, and it's really performed incredibly well in those scenarios. It's super lightweight, it's super versatile. The macro capability is just fantastic to go from shooting long kind of telephoto shots of landscapes and all that to then immediately switch to shooting really close details is really fantastic. And honestly, in the YouTube world, this has been kind of my go-to lens for shooting close-up details of products or cameras or lenses, accessories, something I'm reviewing. It's honestly been a really fantastic lens overall. So if you're in the travel market, landscape, wildlife, events, weddings, documentary, any of that kind of thing, I think this lens is perfect for you. Now, who is this lens not for? And I think the niche on here is kind of specific to low light performance and portraits. So if you're looking for a lens that just can perform the best in low light, I don't think the 7200 f4 is going to be perfect for you, because obviously the aperture only opens up to f4. Now, this is particularly true if you're using a camera that doesn't have great high ISO performance. And so if you're shooting unlike the FX3, where you have that really great high base ISO and you can kind of compensate for that, this might not be as much of a problem for you. It definitely hasn't been for me. But if you're shooting on a camera that just doesn't have as great of high ISO performance, you might want to reconsider purchasing this lens. Or if you shoot a lot of portraits and you're really looking for that depth of field capability, I don't think f4 is going to be your ideal aperture. If you really want to shoot super wide open, honestly, the 7200 f2.8 might not even be for you. You might want to look at the 85 or a 135 that can open all the way up to 1.4. I think the f4 aperture is just going to kind of leave you wanting. Unless one of those very specific use cases is you, I think this lens is a fantastic choice for you. So overall long-term thoughts, this lens has been awesome. I'm really happy with it. For the type of lens it is, it's super lightweight, it's super small, it fits really well in my bag. It has great image quality, great performance. It's honestly performed way better than I thought it would, especially on my FX3 with that high base ISO. Overall, I'm really happy with this lens, and I definitely won't be selling this lens anytime soon. Now, the big question is, do I wish I would have bought the f2.8 version of this lens versus the f4 version of this lens? And honestly, I can say without a shadow of a doubt, no, I don't want the f2.8 version. That lens is bigger, it's $1,000 more expensive, it doesn't have the macro capabilities, and you're only getting a little bit more low light performance. And for me, I'm not going to be using a 7200 for low light performance in general. I'm going to be using like a 135 or an 85 or even a 50 for that. And so for the price point, for the versatility, I think this 7200 f4 is a phenomenal overall lens. So anyway, those are my long-term thoughts on the Sony 7200 f4 OSS G version 2, whatever this lens is called. It's a phenomenal lens. Obviously, these are just my thoughts and my opinions after using this lens for a year. If you've had different thoughts or if you've had different experiences with this lens, please let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your impressions on this lens if you've used it, or if you have any questions for me about this lens, use cases I've been in, scenarios, any of that kind of stuff. Feel free to let me know. Drop me a comment down below or DM me on Instagram, and I would be more than happy to help you out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers. Oh, also, random thing. I just released a LUT LUT pack. And if you haven't checked that out, it would mean the world if you did. It's the LUTs that I use to grade all of my footage here. This entire video was graded with this LUT pack. And if you're looking for a way to support the channel, check out those LUTs. It's a great way to support me, this channel, and help me keep doing what I'm doing. All right, thanks so much for watching. Cheers. See you in the next one.